Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Before I get into today's video, I just want to give a shout out and a thank you to all of our members and patrons. I have some of them listed on the screen here, our producer and executive producer level patrons. But thank you to every single person who supports the channel, even those of you who are not financially able to support the channel, but support this channel by watching videos, by hitting like, by leaving comments, by subscribing. I appreciate every single one of you. And to those who have not met me, my name is Chris. I am married with 3 kids. I live in Northeast Ohio. I majored in history in college, but never really worked in a history field. This has become my outlet for that love that I have had most of my life. So a lot of other videos where I talk a little bit more about my background, and you can check out the VTH Extra channel for more of that. So, I want to dive back into some alternate history today. I love exploring alternate histories, and there's a couple of channels that do a great job of doing that. So we're going to go back to Alternate History Hub today and talk about what if the United States didn't exist? What would the world look like? And of course, the reason I love exploring alternate history is because it gives us a different way of looking at what actually happened in history by exploring what might have happened if certain things had been different. That's why I enjoy this. I think it allows us to take a more detailed look at events and how important they were and how important people were and places and things. So it's just a great way to study history, I think. And as always with alternate history, it's really such a subjective thing. It's really up to our own opinions. And so there's really no right or wrong. So we can disagree based on our own experiences, based on our own knowledge, based on the things we think are important and other people think are more important, and vice versa. So anything I might disagree with him on is simply my own opinion, and you can please express your own disagreement with what I think. Use the comment section below and let me know how you see the stuff that we're going to look at. So let's go ahead and dive into this one today. As always, the link's in the description. You can check out the original content and all of their other content without my commentary. Here we go.
In the grand scheme of human history, the United States of America is an incredibly new country.
Yep.
From its culture and the scale of its military and economic might, the U.S. has been influential since its inception. In the span of just 2 centuries, it went from a disunified band of colonies into the strongest power that has ever been seen.
Yeah, it's so important, and one of the reasons why I encourage anybody who ever has the opportunity and the means to visit some place like Europe if you're an American, because the European and, for that matter, African and Asian concept of old is very, very different than ours. At least ours as Americans. Now, yes, there's history here in North America that goes back long before the United States existed. But I mean, as far as the existing nations of the world, the United States is a baby.
Even by its creation, the United States drastically changed the course of history. So, as a thought exercise, what if it didn't exist? What if, in an alternate timeline, the United States of America never existed? Opens up a lot of questions, doesn't it? For this alternate timeline, let's go back to the 1770s, the American Revolution, as tension grew between the colonies and the British. In this alternate scenario, war begins. The American rebels fight against the British regulars. There were many numerous occasions the US could have been defeated. All it simply took was not having the aid of one foreign ally, an ally who would love to get back at the British. Yes, that's right, the French.
So I was about to say, if I were drawing up an alternate timeline where the United States never exists, the easiest place to look for a diverging timeline is France not intervening. Bottom line, no France, no United States. There is zero chance the U.S. wins its War of Independence without the French. And even with the French, it very nearly could not have might not have happened. I'm not saying that there weren't other important contributions from people like the Dutch and the Spanish, for example, but the French were the indispensable ally. And honestly, the major difference between the U.S. winning its War of Independence and the South losing in the American Civil War was that intervention by a foreign power. The South could not have won the Civil War without that, no matter how many battles they won on the battlefield. Because listen, the South, in terms of battlefield performance, was way more successful than the United States was. The U.S. rarely won a big battle in the Revolution, but they outlasted and then got that very timely help from the French at the end. But even then, in 1781, this could have gone either way easily. If the French fleet doesn't show up at Yorktown, great chance that Cornwallis gets evacuated from Yorktown, or Clinton is able to come down and reinforce him from New York City, and the war goes very differently. U.S. was on its last legs in 1781. If that Yorktown doesn't happen and French intervention doesn't happen, U.S. probably does not last 1781.
The French involvement in the American Revolution saved the rebellion, and without it, the militia surely would have lost. And this wasn't a small contribution. The French involvement meant funding to rebels, supplies, guns, men, and ships.
Guns and ships, and so the balance shifts. Sorry, a little Hamilton reference there.
The British naval fleet. And France wanted revenge so badly, they put themselves in massive debt just to aid the Americans.
And France, and listen, this is why I get a little frustrated with my fellow Americans when we start making fun of the French as being quick to surrender and, all that stuff because of what happened in World War II. I know some of you out there are French that watch this channel. First of all, my experience in France, the time that I spent there, was amazing. The people were amazing and wonderful and welcoming, and I could not have had a better experience. But secondly, the French monarchy ended because of its support of the United States. It bankrupted itself, which just continued the spiral into their own revolution a decade later. And what France did, look at Napoleon and what he was able to accomplish, basically taking on all of Europe by himself for the most part. Yes, he had help, but and then in World War I, just France bore the major brunt of that war as well.
This would come back to haunt them later. I'll talk about that soon. Say in this alternate scenario, France is more fiscally responsible and realize they can't win a war without tanking their finances, and the US is left out to dry. After years of holding out against Native American, British, and German regulars, it's just too much. So, the rebellion crumbles.
Yep.
The British seize control and most of the Continental Congress goes into exile or are arrested. Perhaps negotiations occur between the two to make amends, but this is hard to predict.
Now, there was talk of that, and in fact, at one point, I want to say 1776-ish, there was actually a small group of members of the Continental Congress that I believe included John Adams and maybe Benjamin Franklin too, that actually met with I think it was General and Admiral Howe, the two brothers, who were in command of the Army and the Navy in North America at the time, in New York City, because Howe said that he had authorization to negotiate with the rebels. But basically, it was made clear from the beginning that anything short of independence was not going to be enough for the Americans, and anything short of complete just laying down of their arms and falling back into the British fold wasn't going to be enough for the British. So there's really very little to negotiate. But there was a tiny creak of a door that was left open for that possibility of some kind of a negotiation.
In this alternate timeline, the revolution is crushed, and the experiment that was the United States of America is in the history books, a failed rebellion over anger with the British Parliament. It can't be left unsaid that there is still bitterness among a sizable portion of the colonial population. There's still this culture within the colonies that resent the loss. While the war ends and a majority of American colonists simply move on with their lives, there's still a mentality similar to the South will rise again.
Yeah, and again, keep in mind that this is not a majority mentality, okay? The majority of colonists in 1775 and 1776, when independence is declared, are not in favor of independence. It's probably around a third. It's an oversimplification, and there's no real data to back this up, but most of the time the estimate is there's about a third who are what we would call patriots, the ones who want independence, who are actively supporting rebellion against the crown. There's a third that are loyalists that want to remain a part of Great Britain. And then you have about a third that are kind of in the middle that just are like, let me go live on my farm and do my thing. I don't really want to get involved. And that's kind of the general mindset of things. So I would think in this case, especially after it's been crushed, you're dealing with maybe no more than a third of the people who are going to feel this way.
The relationship between the two is forever changed. The 13 colonies were already kind of different from the rest of the British realms, but now going into the 1790s and the 19th century, it would be painted as the rogue colony which still has an independent tendency. There are immediate changes that result from the US not existing. When the US won the Revolution, in the Treaty of Paris, it was given all of the land east of the Mississippi River.
Which we need to, and I say this all the time,
in the Treaty of Paris, it was
not nearly enough is it discussed that what you see right here is one of the big motivations for the revolution. The British had this policy in place that basically the Appalachian Mountains, and that is how it's pronounced by the majority of people who live in what we call Appalachia, that run right along kind of down through New York, down through the middle of Pennsylvania, right along the border of West Virginia and Virginia, down into North Carolina, Tennessee, and northern Georgia. That whole area is kind of the border for the British colonies, and everything west of there is a no-go zone. And the Americans, the colonists who are here, who already have a lot of land compared to what's available in places in Europe, are seeing all of this land just kind of sparsely populated by Native Americans, and they're thinking, why can't we have all of that too? And so that's a motivation for the war, and it ends up being kind of one of the rewards for people who fight the wars, all these incredible land grants that are given in Kentucky and Tennessee and in Ohio and in western Pennsylvania to people who fought.
Given all of the land east of the Mississippi River. In this alternate scenario, the 13 colonies simply remain the 13 colonies. This changes multiple things, including the path of the British imperial ambitions and the politics of North America as a whole. Let's talk relationships. In this alternate timeline, the American colonists don't have the best relationship with their neighbors. Catholic French Quebec is to the north, and would be despised by the deeply Puritan colonists, and the numerous Native Americans to the west would be an issue as well, except for a few tribes, but I'll discuss that later. In our timeline, when the US was born, Quebec was pushed up to where it is today, and the natives were under American control. But with control of this land under the British Parliament, American colonists are sort of stuck on the coast. In this scenario, Canada, as we think of it, simply doesn't exist. What eventually became Canada had a large population boost after the war, from loyalists who fled the independent United States.
And people still forget that even to this day, Canada is not a really hugely populated country. I think the numbers are in the realm of the same kind of size between the entire nation of Canada and the greater metropolitan area of Mexico City. I mean, that's kind of what we're talking about here. There are metropolitan areas of major cities in the world that have similar populations to the entire nation of Canada. And Canada is huge. And the vast majority of that population lives very near to the southern border, the border with the United States. So yeah, you take away that big influx of loyalists after the Revolution, and maybe Canada doesn't see nearly the growth that it has even today.
It's said that these loyalists were the initial boost that brought Canada as a territory for Britain, being happy to be under the king's rule and all. But without independence, these loyalists stay in the colonies, so Canada doesn't have an influx of English-speaking Brits. But you know what it does have? French Canadians. This land was once under the control of the French in something known as New France, but France lost this land after the 7 Years' War. French colonists were allowed to stay and keep their culture as long as they stayed loyal to the British king. Thus, Quebec was born. In this alternate scenario, Quebec never loses this land and stays incredibly large.
I never would have thought about that, and I'm so glad that he brought that up because I did not think about the United States not existing having a major impact on Canada, but it absolutely would. He's totally right.
One that takes up all of the Great Lakes, the Ohio River, and goes up into the northern seas of the Atlantic. Had Quebec continued to be allowed to rule these lands, the Midwest and the Great Lakes are French-speaking, deeply Catholic territories. But there is a third culture as well. Most of the land south of the Ohio River is entirely populated by Native American tribes. If the treaty with the natives continued, then the British protect native land rights in the Deep South. Inside this territory was what was known as the 5 civilized tribes by the Americans: the Creek, Choctaw, Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Seminole. They were called this because of their general acceptance of many colonial practices into their society, and the colonists held by comparison pretty good views of the natives as well, in comparison to other minorities.
Yeah, I mean, we tend to view more favorably people who are more like us, right? And so if within these civilized tribes, as they're known, they're adopting similar clothing, they adopt Christianity, they adopt similar laws and customs, then yeah, you're going to tend to view them more favorably because they're a little more like you are.
It was often thought that if the native tribes simply adopted European culture, they'd be on equal footing with the colonists. As decades go by in this alternate timeline, interaction with British Americans and the Quebec Canadians slowly alter these 5 tribal societies into adapting more European practices. Not much can be said other than the native tribes of the South remain prominent members who may eventually adopt colonial ways. Who knows? It's commonly taught in school that the American Revolution had an immediate impact throughout the world. And that's true, just not in the way we think. Remember when I said France was a key ally to the American rebels? That aid required money. That money had to come from somewhere, and the French monarchy didn't have it. The monarchy...
Yeah, I mean, so I'm already starting to think of how different the world's going to be, right? So the ripple effect of France not going into debt, if that means France ends up not having a revolution, that means there's no Napoleon, that means there's no Napoleonic Wars, that means there's no Congress of Vienna, as we just discussed. Is there then ever a Germany, for example? Does Europe look anything like it does today? We don't even have to talk about things like if the U.S. doesn't exist, what happens with World War I? Well, there probably isn't a World War I because there's no Napoleonic Wars, which kind of are part of the process of leading to World War I. It's fascinating.
It put itself into a large amount of debt. This debt created a financial crisis, and without getting into too many details, this was the crisis which led to the chain of events that eventually brought down the monarchy, led to the French Revolution, and eventually Napoleon. In this alternate timeline, Britain crushes the American rebels since France doesn't get involved. Sure, the French monarchy is still in debt, but without this financial crisis, because no war, they can kick that can down the road by at least a few decades.
Yeah, and if you kick it down the road by a few decades, maybe you get a monarch who's a little more, I guess the word I'm looking for is proficient at dealing with it. Louis XVI was one of those monarchs. I think Nicholas II's another one who just didn't read the room very well and seemed to make all the wrong choices when things started unfolding. And so maybe if Louis XVI survives and his son takes the throne, maybe his son does a better job of dealing with this stuff when the time comes.
By doing so, Napoleon's opportunity to seize power doesn't happen. The Napoleonic Wars never occur. The Holy Roman Empire is not obliterated by the French invasion, and the hundreds of little German states aren't reorganized into 30 with the Confederation of the Rhine. There is never a rise of Prussia, and so the German Empire is never formed. It can't be underestimated how much Napoleon not coming to power affected global history, as Napoleon's forces invaded Spain and Portugal, bringing their colonies into chaos. In this alternate timeline, without the United States, there is no immediate military catastrophe to weaken these empires. They remain prominent and powerful. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, the New World is still prime real estate for European colonization. The British and Spanish are pretty much the only ones left.
So then another question, and I don't know if he'll get this far or not, I'm just trying to think ahead and anticipate here. If the colonies in North and South America remain in the hands of their European overlords, do these European nations then still change their focus onto Africa. Because I think part of the reason why they start colonizing Africa is when they start losing their grip on the Western Hemisphere. So I wonder.
With the Russians in Alaska, which leaves New Spain in the question. It's doubtful the Spanish would have risked war over the territory if the British wanted it enough. The British expand slowly across the North American continent. However, what changes is how they interact with the native tribes instead of the Americans. Manifest Destiny was a uniquely American ideal that wouldn't exist in this alternate time.
100% right again. I think this so far is probably the alternate history that he has done that I find myself most in agreement with. Yeah, Manifest Destiny changes everything as far as the relationship with Native American tribes. Maybe Native American tribes never get wiped out to the degree that we see in our timeline.
Instead, it's likely the British would interact with the native tribes and give them autonomy, essentially splitting North America up into native-dominated provinces in the West with white colonists. This is the undoubtable effect of the United States losing the revolution and not existing, the transformation of British imperial policy around the world. Think of it like soul-searching, but with warships. Losing the United States ended the First Empire, and the British funded exploration ships to go find new lands to settle. This led to the discovery of Australia and New Zealand. It also lent to the British to become more invested in conquering lands in Africa and all of India. With North America, though, Britain simply invests in this massive territory of land. As industrialization arrives, the British banned slavery and the slave trade as a whole. This would create extreme unrest in the United States.
Yeah, again, can't argue with that. I mean, I think that the British are moving down that path toward banning the slave trade and then slavery itself by the time of the Revolution.
But the British still banned slavery, and the issue is finished by the 1830s. The British have access to the bountiful amount of oil, natural gas, and coal left untapped in North America. The change here is the balance in power in the world. Not only that, but the balance of power in Europe. Germany remains divided for the entire 19th century, meaning World War I and World War II never occur. Yet some alternate war probably would happen. As for North America...
And that's another important point to make in all this. As we say things like, wow, in this timeline there's no World War I, no World War II. That doesn't mean there wouldn't have been something else in its place, right? I mean, we as a people throughout history have always fought wars, and as technology develops and as governments evolve, there still would have been wars. They just would have looked differently than the ones we actually had.
The British Dominion of North America is a diverse land. The 13 colonies still exist and are culturally different from the rest of the continent. Native Americans make up a predominant section of Western North America, while white colonists dominate the western coast. This is, however, simply one scenario. We'll never truly know what will happen. This is just one thought exercise. The United States has always been a land where people from around the world have came to create a new life. And since I'm here, and I have a life, that means that at some point in history, my ancestors had to have gotten on that boat, or flew as I like to imagine, and just stayed in the United States until generations later, I was born. I've always kind of wondered where my ancestors came from. So in sponsorship with Ancestry, I actually found out.
Very cool. I want to get sponsored by Ancestry DNA. Love Ancestry, love DNA, and I do need to do some more genealogy-related stuff, and a lot of you have been asking for that, so be watching for that in the very near future. We'll get into some more helpful tips and stuff on researching your family history. So I guess that is going to be all. I'll double-check and make sure there's nothing else to this. All right, well, we're going to wrap it up right there. As I said, definitely check out that channel. A lot of incredible stuff there. Really, like he said, it's a thought exercise. It gives you stuff to think about that you never considered before about how important certain events are and the ripple effect that every event has on the rest of history, even in places that seem to be unrelated. So, cool stuff. Hope you enjoyed that conversation. Please add to the conversation down below. Let me know your theories, your ideas. What do you agree with that I said or he said? What do you disagree with? How do you see things playing out? Let's learn together. Thanks for watching.